Good evening, my name is Christina Limo, and I will be summarizing the findings of my capstone project for the Masters of Science program in Bioethics for the University of Mary. So, the parameters of the capstone project were to come up with a bioethical dilemma, then choose a process for ethical decision making, and apply it to the bioethical dilemma and solve it and come up with some conclusions. So, the ethical decision-making framework, which I used, was taken from the moral theologian Germain Grisey's book, The Way of the Lord Jesus, specifically from chapter 5, Seeking Moral Truth, Moral Judgment, and Problem Solving. And I applied this to the issue of physician-assisted suicide, henceforth PAS, in Canada. So the bioethical dilemma was this. In Canada, physician-assisted suicide, or PAS, was legalized as of 2015. In my home province of Ontario, where Catholic healthcare is publicly funded, and there is no privatization of healthcare at all in this province, Catholic healthcare professionals and facility face not so much of a dilemma as challenges, which I suppose is another way of saying dilemma. Currently, practices is that when a patient presents requesting PAS, that the Catholic healthcare facility transfer them to a non-objecting healthcare facility, since it is obviously unethical to keep a patient against their will. However, for my bioethical dilemma specifically, I am arguing that Catholic healthcare professionals and facilities actually have a positive moral duty to not simply transfer patients to another hospital, but before they do that, to attempt to engage in non-coercive but interceptive practices to locate the motivation behind a patient's request for PAS and address it to the best of their abilities in the hopes that a patient will actually change their mind and no longer request PAS. So the first step of the process found in Germain Grisey's books is to clarify the facts and data of the case sufficient for the patient to make an informed decision and have informed consent for the procedure. So the first thing that a doctor or Catholic physician should look for is this patient actually requesting physician-assisted suicide, or is the patient actually wanting to end burdensome treatment? And this is an important distinction because in popular knowledge, it is very, very rare to find people who are able to articulate the difference between a legitimate refusal of unnecessary and burdensome care, the difference between that and actively killing a person. And obviously in the Catholic moral tradition, we know that there is a difference. So the doctor has to clarify the facts. Can this person's suffering and pain be relieved by simply withholding or withdrawing burdensome and disproportionate treatment? Further to that, is this patient aware of the fact that effective pain relief applied properly is in itself morally licit, and to the point of palliative sedation? And that being the case, that it is morally licit when we apply the principle of double effect and find that the intention of the use of pain relief medication is to relieve pain and not to hasten the death of the patient, even though the foreseen circumstance may be that inevitably their death is hastened a little bit in this process, although the intention is not to hasten their death. And knowing that palliative sedation in the event of extreme pain is possible following these criteria. And finally, in clarifying these facts, once the physician or facility determines whether it is actually PAS that a patient is requesting or perhaps misinformation, that they provide all of this information to the patient sufficient for the patient to give informed consent. The second part of the process is ensuring that the objective dimensions of the action are sound. And in this case, engaging in PAS, the Catholic moral tradition and ethics would say that objectively, any involvement in physician-assisted suicide or the direct killing of an individual is never acceptable. So the objective action of engaging in PAS is not morally sound. We see this in the Catechism of the Catholic Church in number 2281, where it indicates that suicide is gravely contrary to the just love of self, and similarly in the Catechism in number 2282, that those who assist in others' suicide is contrary to the moral law. So objectively, we know that physician-assisted suicide, or PAS, is in fact unacceptable. Now, the subjective dimensions of the action, we need to determine if those are sound. Now, this requires going into a patient's history. What are the motivations for this person requesting PAS? And to illustrate the prime motivations behind patients' requests of PAS, I'd like to quote a study from Washington in 2014, which was conducted by the State Department of Health, and it was published, which illustrated the types of fears which consumes patients who are requesting PAS. And this includes 89% of these patients who requested PAS were afraid of loss of autonomy, 79% loss of dignity, 94% were afraid of loss of ability to partake in activities which make life enjoyable, 59% were afraid of being a burden to family, friends, or caregivers, 51% were afraid of losing control of bodily functions, 41% of potential future inadequacy of pain control, and 8% were afraid about surrounding financial concerns. So we see that the subjective dimensions may change, whether they're financial or emotional or physical in terms of pain, but the point is that they're all connected by the common denominator of being motivated by fear. Thus, the subjective dimensions of the action, that of the patient requesting PAS, are not sound, because good moral and ethical decisions cannot be made using fear as a motivator. So fourth part of the process is striving to enact and build the virtues. And so Germain Grisset says that this is important because above all, we will not be able to engage in right action if we do not prepare ourselves. So it's the equivalent of attempting to run a marathon without practicing running to some degree prior to the day of the marathon. It just simply can't be done. And so this places mostly, I think, the burden on the Catholic health professional and facility to help the patients to do this, because patients come from a number of backgrounds, a number of different faith backgrounds, some of no faith at all, and we cannot be certain that they are aware of what it means to exercise the virtues. I think the most important, though, in terms of life or death issues, and especially at the end of life, is the importance of hope, and specifically Christian hope. Because having hope is not enough. Because the moral virtue of hope is hope in the saving power of the resurrection. It is evident that a patient is not going to find sufficient hope in earthly things. If there were the ability to instill hope in patients without anything transcendental or existential, such as God or a belief in an afterlife, then I believe that the widespread legalization in Western countries of things like PAS and euthanasia would not be happening. This is an indication that we are not meeting the needs of people who are requesting death. So how does a Catholic healthcare practitioner facility do this? Well, actually, they do this by evangelization and through evangelization. I think ultimately throughout this whole project, my practicum hours and my research, that I have realized that without evangelization, that this is not possible. that it is important that principled Catholic healthcare include evangelization in their care for the person, so that it is not just physical or emotional or psychological, but also spiritual, and that it is only the Christian virtue of hope that will instill in a patient the ability to overcome their suffering. So that being said, it is my belief that if a patient presents to a Catholic hospital or a physician in Ontario, Canada, requesting physician-assisted suicide, that instead of simply transferring the patient to another facility for care, that the Catholic hospital and facility have a positive moral obligation to locate the motivations and reasoning behind a patient's request for PAS and to address them to the best of their ability in the hopes that the patient will change their mind. Thank you for listening.